Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia. In this episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts, we take a look at the Death Fleet. The Death Fleet was the ships in the Second Fleet, the Neptune, the Surprise and the Scarborough. We know in the Second Fleet there were 6 ships. The first being the Lady Juliana, who set sail from Plymouth in the June of 1789. The Guardian also left shortly after and was damaged when hitting an iceberg off the coast of Cape of Good Hope. The next ship in the Second Fleet was the Justinian. It was also a supply ship, and that sailed without any problems to Port Jackson. The Justinian was quite swift, only making 2 stops on the voyage. It only took 5 months for the Justinian to arrive into Port Jackson. It was lucky it arrived when it did, as the Lady Juliana had only arrived some weeks before. The Justinian was carrying 1,400 casks of flour, 233 barrels of pork, as well as beef, oatmeal, vinegar, spirits, oil and sugar. On board was also cloth, clothing, blankets and a portable military hospital. With a crew of 36, Benjamin Maitland commanded the ship. The Justinian left Cornwall on the 17th of February 1790 and arrived in Port Jackson on the 20th of June 1790, only 2 weeks after the Lady Juliana. The successful arrival of the Justinian meant that the colony was saved. There wouldn't be starvation, at least not for a while. The joy of its arrival, however, was overshadowed by the darkness that sailed in shortly after. On the 17th of January 1790, the Neptune, along with the Surprise and the Scarborough, left English waters. The Neptune carried 421 male convicts, 78 female convicts, together with 83 crew. There was also Darcy Wentworth and William Gray, who were both surgeons, and Lieutenant John Shapcote, a naval agent sent to ensure that the ship's contractual terms were met. There was also 7 officers, 44 men from the New South Wales Corps, 6 of their wives, and 3 of the soldiers' children. There was also 6 wives of convicts and 5 of their children. The New South Wales Corps included Captain Nicholas Nepean and Lieutenant John MacArthur, his wife Elizabeth and their son Edward also. All 3 ships carried a cargo of flour, salted beef and pork, but only the Neptune carried women convicts. There was orders for the female convicts aboard the Neptune to be kept away from the men. As well as being unchained, they were also on a higher deck. The men, like the other 2 ships, were barbarically chained together and in filthy conditions. The Neptune's voyage started on a sour note. A journal kept by Elizabeth MacArthur details how her husband John MacArthur and the master Thomas Gilbert had a disagreement and went on land to have the duel. It has been noted as being bloodless, meaning there was no blood shed, but they definitely had it out. This caused Thomas Gilbert, the master of the ship, to be dismissed and replaced by a Donald Trail. Elizabeth was happy to see Thomas Gilbert removed, but she also mentions in her journals that the replacement Donald was no better. He was actually worse, and she's called him a perfect sea monster. Early on the voyage, Elizabeth notes in the journals that leaving England waters was quite scary. They had had some bad weather and the waves must have been quite high. She notes it as being violent, and she was worried that the ship may not be able to handle the rough sea. She also states that their living apartments were quite close to the female convicts. They were sharing the same deck. Her son Edward becomes sick around the 25th of January, as well as her servant coming down with a fever. The fever had been running rife through the female convicts. There was nothing that she could do about this, as earlier, when they first found out that they would be sharing their area with the female convicts, John MacArthur went to Captain Nepean and tried to ask for some changes. However, there was nowhere else for the female convicts to go, and they were denied. Elizabeth had hoped that all the problems they were going to encounter on the ship were coming to an end. She even says how vain they were to flatter themselves. Unfortunately, though, things were about to get worse. Some of the officers were complaining that their rations were being stolen. Lieutenant John MacArthur took it upon himself to go and speak to Captain Nepean again to see if anything could be done. Captain Nepean replied, "Trail does everything to oblige me, and I must give up some points to him. I will see into it." Elizabeth often met with her husband, and she'd often go up to the top deck, taking the same route. She did notice, however, on one occasion she went to a door that she often took, but it was nailed shut. She went and told her husband right away. John went and investigated this with Captain Nepean, and apparently the reason for the door being nailed shut was to prevent John from listening in to the captain and the master. He got upset and he wrote a letter right away to the naval agent, Lieutenant John Shapcote. He was also replied with that he should not quarrel with Mr. Trail, as the master of the ship can do as he pleases. This now meant that Elizabeth, when wanting to go to the upper deck, had to go through where the convicts were. Shortly after, most of the ship became sick. Elizabeth writes that she kept herself in the cabin. She didn't want to get sick, but now could not get any fresh air or exercise. She said this was similar to the poor convicts below them, who also didn't get any air or exercise. She also mentions that the weather was very hot while they were nearing the equator, and it was particularly miserable inside the cabin. She also mentions that the rations were becoming very small. They were only given 5 quarts of water. She noted that her servant who went to get these was stopped and interrogated, the water measured. She knew that the livestock on board were getting more water, as well as the water for the master himself and his mates. It wasn't just the convicts who had their rations reduced. Elizabeth also writes that John had spoken to her about an occasion where he witnessed a servant upset that he had been cheated out of some of his rations. When John stepped in, he was abused by the master's crew. John went to Captain Nepean immediately, and when he didn't get any justice, he advised the captain that he and his wife and child would leave the ship and board the Scarborough. It was the 17th of February when they stopped at port. Elizabeth had gathered all of their bags and they boarded the Scarborough. However, very soon after leaving the port, John MacArthur becomes very ill and feverish, as does Edward. I'm not even sure Edward has completely recovered from the fever he had aboard the Neptune. She writes about John's illness. A few days before we quitted False Bay, Mr. MacArthur was attacked with a violent and very alarming fever. It continued to rage till every sense was lost, and every faculty but life destroyed, and my little boy at the same time was so very ill that I could scarcely expect him to survive a day. Alone, unfriended, and in such a situation, what do I not owe to a merciful God for granting me support and assistance? A few of the pages are now torn from her journal, but it does appear that she writes that Captain Marshall and Captain Reed aboard the Scarborough give her every assistance they could provide, and she is very indebted to them. Several more pages are lost. However, she does say that Mr. MacArthur and Edward both regain their strength once again. And it says here that Mr. MacArthur finally is able to walk unassisted. So he must have really been taken out. John, Elizabeth and Edward were lucky to be able to board the Scarborough. Unfortunately for many of the passengers on the Neptune, this was not possible, including the convicts, especially the male convicts who were trapped down at the bottom of the ship, not able to come up to the deck for 159 days. It must have been an awful feeling for them, not to mention that their rations were cut so as that the master could profit at the end of the journey. Many of the male convicts became sick with scurvy by the time they reached the Cape of Good Hope, and a large amount had died at sea. There were stories how some of the convicts would conceal the death of other convicts next to them so as that they could eat their rations. It must have been terrible to be stuck next to a dead body for the majority of the ship just so you can get a little extra food. We think about how many rights we have now as humans. These people weren't even treated like humans. The heavy irons that were used to chain them together started to blister and cut into their flesh. There are many accounts on the arrival into Port Jackson. People on the land were shocked to see the condition of these men as they started to come off the ships. Most, in fact, couldn't even walk. A lot of them were thrown overboard by some of the crew. Others scampered on all fours. They could see deep wounds in their wrists from the irons. Some men had bloated stomachs and were cramping, doubled over, in pain. And the ones that were thrown into the sea, some of them didn't even survive that. Unable to swim, with no energy, they drowned. The shocked onlookers could do nothing but watch. The stories quickly spread throughout the colony, some of the convicts even admitting to eating some of the oatmeal that had been put in their wounds to stop infection. It was a brutal voyage, ravaged by disease, starving. Even after arriving, up to 10 people died per day for the next few weeks. It was quickly learned that the contractors, the masters on board the ship, were cutting corners. There was also, aboard the Scarborough, a whisper of mutiny. Shortly after they left, the mutiny was being plotted by several convicts. They chose the leader, Samuel Burt, but they chose badly, as Samuel Burt revealed all of the ideas to the ship's officers. The plotters were interrogated and severely flogged. Some were chained to the deck, but this meant ultimately all of the male convicts would be staying below deck for the duration of the voyage. These captains had previously been overseeing slave ships. Reverend Richard Johnson, the First Fleet chaplain, who witnessed from the land the Second Fleet coming in, tells of the awful account firsthand. I beheld a sight truly shocking to the feelings of humanity, a great number of them laying, some half, others nearly quite naked, without either bed or bedding, unable to turn or help themselves. Spoke to them as I passed along, but the smell was so offensive that I could scarcely bear it. The landing of these people was truly affecting and shocking. Great numbers were not able to walk nor to move hand or foot. Such were slung over the ship's side in the same manner as they would a cask or box or anything of that nature. Upon their being brought up to the open air, some fainted, some died upon deck, and others in the boat before they even reached the shore. Some creeped upon their hands and knees, and some were carried upon the backs of others. Of the 928 male convicts aboard the Neptune, Scarborough and Surprize, 26% died on the voyage, and nearly 40% were dead within months of arriving in the colony. This was nearly 10 times that of the First Fleet voyage. The First Fleet arrived in New South Wales with a mortality rate of 5.4%. The Second Fleet arrived in New South Wales with a mortality rate of 40%. It is no surprise that the Second Fleet was known as the Death Fleet. They truly were a fleet of the dead. We understand that the First Fleet was controlled by the British. The government and transports were monitored by Governor Phillip and the two naval ships Sirius and Supply. It was a very expensive outfit, so for the Second Fleet, they decided to cut corners, allowing the contractors to take ownership of the voyage for the Neptune, Scarborough and Surprize, and this was the outcome. Being able to keep the supplies at the end of the voyage for money, they were always going to cut corners with food. But even the accounts of Elizabeth MacArthur prove that it wasn't just the convicts who were missing out. They fared a little better on the Scarborough, but it does seem there was no care for these convicts. Overcrowded, kept below deck for such a long time in bad weather, it is a surprise any of them survived at all. They may have saved a lot of money, but in the end, there was a big trial. But payment wasn't dependent on how many people reached Australia alive. It was a disaster. We understand that there was a bidding war for the contracts. The British government gave the contract to the people who bid the least amount. 267 people died at sea, and at least 150 died shortly after arrival, Neptune being the worst of all. Out of the 499 on board, only 72 arrived in reasonable health, possibly mostly the female convicts who were on an upper deck. 158 died. 269 were incapacitated at the time of the landing. A second captain in the New South Wales Corps who sailed with the fleet told officials the conditions of the slave trade were better than the second fleet. He wrote about the masters aboard the Neptune and the Scarborough as being cruel men. The more they can withhold from the unhappy wretches, the more provisions they have to dispose of on a foreign market. And the earlier in the voyage they die, the longer they can draw the deceased's allowance for themselves. For I fear few of them are honest enough to make a just return of the dates of their deaths to their employers. William Hill was disgusted. The second fleet was a disaster. Only 2 of the ships arrived in fair health, the Justinian and the Lady Juliana. It is amazing also that we learn that several of the second fleet crewmen had deserted the ships. By the time some of the ships arrived back into England in September of 1791, British newspapers had already heard about the horrendous treatment of the convicts. A lawyer, Thomas Evans, launched a private prosecution in the London courts in the following November. The Neptune's master, Donald Trail, a former Navy master who had commanded a slave ship, was described by many as a sadist. He was brought to trial at the Old Bailey, along with his chief mate, William Ellington. According to historians, the trial was initially about unpaid wages for the seamen on the voyage, but the issue raised about the brutal treatment of the convicts dominated. Trail and Ellington were acquitted in that trial, and the government defended them when it raised it in Parliament. With the Revolutionary War with France pending, the Second Fleet disaster faded into the background. It is quite interesting also that we learn that the same contractors bring out the Third Fleet in 1791, but there had been changes in the contract by then, as well as incentives to encourage them to keep the convicts alive until they reached Australia. So there was a positive to come out of the Second Fleet deaths. There was change. Surprisingly, there is a love story that comes out of all of this horror. Darcy Wentworth was an Irish surgeon, the first paying passenger to arrive in the new colony of New South Wales, who leaves his love behind in England, a Jane Austen, meets a young convict girl, a Catherine Crowley, on board the Neptune. They do have a son, William Charles Wentworth, born at sea on the Surprize, on its way to Norfolk Island in a violent storm. 2 more sons followed, Darcy born in 1793 and John in 1795. Sadly, their love story doesn't last forever. Not being able to escape the death associated with the Death Fleet, they lose a daughter, as well as Catherine losing her life in 1800. In 1802, Wentworth sends his 2 elder sons, William and Darcy, to school in England. In 1805, he sends his younger son John to join them. Their eldest child, William Charles Wentworth, becomes an Australian explorer, journalist, politician and author. Also one of the leading figures of early colonial New South Wales. He was the first native-born Australian to achieve a reputation overseas. He dies in 1872 in England. The boys must have done really well. The second-born, Darcy, named after his father, also becomes a major. He was also in the 73rd Regiment in February 1811, which was actually sent to New South Wales. He must have met up with his father at this time, who was still in Sydney. Tragically, their youngest son, John, died of yellow fever whilst at sea on the 20th of February 1820 and was confined to the deep following his last rites from the Church of England, this meaning he had a sea burial. Darcy Wentworth Sr. has quite an interesting life. He actually served under the first 7 governors of the colony from 1810 to 1821 and was a great assistant to Governor Lachlan Macquarie. Darcy Wentworth is also named as a ringleader in the Rum Rebellion, which we'll get to in another episode. He dies in 1827 in a Sydney suburb, Homebush. He's buried at St John's Cemetery in Parramatta, also one of our previous episodes, and Catherine is also buried with him. Although the Second Fleet has not been as popular as the First Fleet in our history, it is very important that we remember all the people who didn't make it. We remember a lot of the stories of those who did, and we've got plenty of descendants to keep those stories alive. But it is important that we tell these stories, including the ones of people who didn't even make it. Create the awareness as a historical moment in time for Australia. We hope in a future episode to go and visit the areas in these stories and see if we may be able to talk to those who've been left behind in history. Stay tuned for more episodes in our Halloween special. We do hope you enjoy watching.